So welcome everyone, and especially our two guests, Richard Sandell and Cristina Lleras. Thank you for accepting our invitation to have this informal conversation today and to try to go a bit deeper into the idea of an activist museum, and more than the idea, perhaps the practice of an activist museum. I would like to briefly present our guests. Their bio notes are on our website. Cristina Lleras is a Colombian independent curator. Currently, she's the curator for the Museo de Bogotá, a government-run city museum in Colombia's capital. In the past, she headed the curatorial and educational team of the Museum of Memory of Colombia and collaborated with the Truth Commission, as well as the National Commission for Reparation and Reconciliation in curatorial work, among other things. Richard Sandell is a professor of museum studies and director of the Research Center for Museums and Galleries at the University of Leicester. Through the Research Center, Richard works collaboratively with cultural institutions on projects that fortunately generate new insights and advanced thinking and practice around the social role of museums, their responsibilities and agency. Some of the most recent collaborations include galleries such as Being Human at the Wellcome Collection in London, or the beautiful project Prejudice and Pride with the National Trust a couple of years ago. And in 2019, Richard and together with Robert James were the co-editors of the book Museum Activism. So thank you very much for joining us today. We have 60 minutes. We have 1 hour, and we'll try to make good use of our time. So our idea, we discussed this before, is to structure this conversation trying to define, first of all, what we understand, what is the activist museum, what are the attributes of the activist museum, and then concentrate specifically on something that is troubling us or make us think a lot about what this means in practice, which is how we deal with activism within the museum among members of the team. So I would like to start by asking you specifically the question of what does the activist museum stand for? How can we define it? How does it sound? How does it smell? How do we feel it? Cristina, would you like to start?
Thank you, Maria. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and with Richard. I think that the activist museum has a lot of sound. It needs to make noise because the activist museum has to respond to what the current events and the social unrest and the violation of rights and what all of these things mean for societies. So I think it's tricky because on the one hand, these social issues could be made an instrument of, let's say, museum work that is not deeply committed to transformation, but at the same time, turning our heads away from whatever is going on in our different societies would not be the right way to go. So I think the activist museum is engaged and it's a listening device. And I think it's also a platform to connect different preoccupations. Sometimes it's just a device to listen. So I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, Richard?
I love those characteristics, Cristina. From my point of view, I'm wondering if there's almost, its meaning has evolved and is still evolving for me now, really. I think there are possibly two seemingly contradictory sides to it for me. One of them is very radical and one is very kind of normative, and they feel like two sides of the same coin. You know, on the kind of radical side, aligning with Cristina's notion of noise and being highly attuned to and active in the world, like really prepared to take a stand and be really active in shaping and responding to the world around us. And of course, that radical side conjures up things like banners and placards and protests. And then the other side, and actually the other side aligns quite closely with a definition that we used in the book, Museum Activism, which is much more normative, which is about saying the activist museum is one that harnesses its resources towards a better world. And in that sense, it appeals to all of us. It perhaps is something which we argue all museums can do, all museums should do, but it is, you know, when we gathered the contributors together for the book, we were noticing this turn across the field globally, a greater openness towards saying we can make a difference. We're often complicit in the bad stuff. How can we reconfigure that to kind of rebuild the museum as a force for good? And in that sense, it's highly normative, and you can't argue with it. The term itself maybe conjures up something that many people find less easy to bring into the museum world.
It is true. There is some kind of discomfort sometimes around the word activism, because we tend to see it perhaps as something violent necessarily, whereas when I was listening to Cristina giving her definition, I remembered of John Berger, who said that listening is a way of activism. And perhaps that's the starting point. There is another definition that Jenny Carville-Schellenbacher shared in an article. She said that the activist museum has an explicit agenda. Its activism is reflected in all aspects of their work. An activist museum offers concrete actions for visitors who wish to be more active citizens. And activist museums offer space to oppositional opinions. How do we choose that agenda? Who chooses the agenda? Well, from your experience, I mean, it's easy to say it's somebody high there who decides, but who? Whoever, yeah, don't expect me to just.
I mean, I could jump in there. I guess if I think about the projects that I've been involved with, they've involved a process of thinking deeply with a cultural organisation to arrive at that position, that agenda, so that it's not something that's just instinctively plucked from a number of different positions, but it's a process of deep thinking so that the rationale, the thinking behind that positioning, that agenda is well thought through. But I think it can come from different places. You know, it can come, there's in some of the work we've been doing, I might draw down the law. There are legal possibilities to highlight particular injustices against particular groups. I don't think the law in itself is sufficient very often for the kind of work we're doing. I look at social movements, particularly rights-based movements, and look at the kinds of concepts and principles and philosophies that underpin them. So, for example, in the global disability rights movement, there is some, with all the different positions and tensions within that, there is some degree of consensus around particular ways of thinking, particular kind of moral and ethical concepts that can really shape and guide your work. I guess a third possibility, but again, fraught with problems, would be one that's fairly consensual, like a public opinion. And I think it's often the problem because some of the most, not always, but some of the most powerful activist work is kind of rubbing up against a popular public opinion, which is problematic. For example, racist, deeply embedded in our structures. So we have to find the rationale, we have to find the conceptual underpinning, partly because it will guide us, but also I think fundamentally because it gives us confidence to defend and take forward that position in the face of a pushback. So again, rather than plucking it from the air, having resolved and worked through to arrive at a position, knowing that that is likely not to please everybody. The very nature of activism involves social change, so you're always going to be pushing against some constituencies. So I think that process of deep thinking is a really important one, but I think the source of insight or authority can come from a number of different places.
Cristina, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, listening to Richard, I was thinking about the frame for my own experience as a curator. So when I worked for the Museum of Memory, the museum is actually a museum that is proposed by a law, and it's in the context of symbolic reparation for victims of internal armed conflict in Colombia. So you could immediately think that that law kind of gives it that attribute that, of course, its work has to be activist in a way of recognizing the damage, but also, well, we could get into layers and layers of this, but so that's one thing. And now that I'm working for the City Museum, which you could say, you know, it's a historical museum, you know, we can just say we look back on the development of the city, but our question since last year with our colleagues, and especially, and obviously because of lockdowns and the pandemic, was how do we, through our digital channels, how do we engage in a conversation about what is going on? So we ended up doing an online project, mainly through Instagram. And what we tried to do is sort of bring that past back from the 1918 influenza, which left no corner of the world untouched, and also carried out like there was a deep impact in the context of the First World War. And we try to sort of bring that past in terms of what that past could illuminate for us. So as a sort of conventional historic museum, we keep asking ourselves that question of what do we need to do with that past in order for it to become relevant, and what can we learn from our collections, but not just so we post nice black and white photographs on our social media. It's because the past can teach us, certainly can teach us some very important lessons. And regarding this issue of public opinion, I also think that what we've tried to do is try to sort of, through our digital media, try to grasp what our audiences think the museum might be useful for. So actually, as we are now in Colombia in a very difficult moment of social unrest, we were asking our audiences yesterday, can museums be of any use right now? Can we talk about International Museum Day right now? What and how can museums be supporting processes that are going on now in our societies? I think that's just a continuous question that we need to ask ourselves.
Do people respond to these kind of questions? Do they feel involved? Do they feel it is an actual invitation for them to get involved and to give you feedback?
Yes, they did respond. It was just a very sort of yes and no question. And actually my colleague just told me this morning that it was the most, like it was it was a very short story on our Instagram, but it was like the most engagement we've ever had. So after we finish this conversation, I'm gonna find out about the results of the question. But there's also, you know, people are giving interesting critiques about how do we go on with business as usual as the cultural sector. And there's other colleagues in other museums that I know are having a difficult time because they are not free to speak their minds. And I know we're going to talk about this. because their patrons might not agree with how they're looking at things. So yeah, I think it's the conversation that we need to sort of be attuned to, and the sort of empathic eyesight that we need to have with whatever is going on.
Yeah, somehow you do connect it again to the question of listening. Yeah, not just to the people immediately around us within the museum, but what's coming from outside too. I was thinking that many times as people, as citizens, we feel helpless. There are things that look very big for us to do something about it. And one of the lessons I learned in a museum some years ago was at the National Holocaust Memorial Museum. They have a special in Washington, and they have a special area discussing genocide. And there was a big question there of what can you do in case genocide is going on? And it impressed me, but and I didn't forget it. That's when a museum actually has an impact on us. It said the first thing you can do is to be informed. The least you can do is to be informed. Is to know what's going on. And the second thing is to let other people know. So if we consider what activism is and how small we feel in front of things, sometimes museums can give us this idea of you don't need to be big as well to confront something that is big. You can be small and make a difference, or in your immediate environment, and that's a way of empowering people as well. Yeah, giving people a kind of scale and make them feel that they don't need to be afraid of the big things because they can do their own small thing. No.
I think that's
sorry, go on, Cristina.
No, I was just going to say that as museum professionals, we also feel very sort of helpless, you know, because we're looking at our collections, or we're looking at our exhibitions, and yeah, we're trying to do small things on our social media, but I've had this feeling of helplessness for a very long time. But you know, the trick is, how do we keep going? And in the different projects that I've been able to contribute to, we've started to find ways to answer that question. But I also think that it's, you know, the idea of the museum sort of giving you this gift, but this gift is double-sided, right? It poses big questions like the one that you just mentioned, but at the same time, I think that we need to be more responsible about what tools we give audiences to answer that question. So I think it's not enough to pose the question. I think if we're going to pose the question, we need to care for our audiences as well.
You're right. Richard.
I really like that. One of the projects we did most recently was called Humankind. It looked at explored the role of museums and culture in tackling social isolation and loneliness. And we took that idea of giving people the small steps to help build change in the face of helplessness quite literally. So we had at the end of the visitor experience, there was a pledge wall, and you could pick from one of 20 pledges. They were like little cards, and if you picked a card, you were trying to get the visitor to commit to some small act which would tackle social isolation and loneliness. And that could be as small as opening a conversation with a stranger, to donating to a food bank, to more sort of radical acts of volunteering for particular groups and so on. But it was kind of built around Cristina's idea of raising big questions and giving people ways through it, really. So they'd been through quite a big, we hoped quite highly affective experience that told lots of human stories of isolation and loneliness, kindness and compassion. So you had this kind of rich experience, and then invited people to think, what do you want to do about it? So it could be something quite small, or in your case, Maria, of the Holocaust Museum, you know, just giving people, in the face of that extraordinary kind of paralyzing horror, what could you do? Well, you could find out more about it, and you could have a conversation with someone about it. So those sort of that individual agencies feels like an important thread, really, in perhaps some of the activism work that we're talking about.
Listening to you, I remember also a TED talk I watched some months ago, and I think the title is "The Museums Should Be About the Everyday and Not Just the Extraordinary." And I associate this to something Angela Davis said, that we tend to discuss history as, you know, something that happened thanks to heroes, and that makes perhaps us citizens today feel small because we don't see them ourselves as heroes. And perhaps all the stories should come up as well, and all the ways and all the possibilities and the different kind of imagination where I can find myself in the world, my place in the world, and discover my agency around things. Yeah. Maybe I make just a small break, since we had this technical problem with transmitting our conversation on Facebook, just to welcome everybody who's with us today. We are recording this conversation, so later on you will find it if you didn't join us from the beginning. And also, if you would like to ask some questions, please use the chat, and we'll try to answer them. So let's go a bit deeper inside now and discuss the question of dissent within the museum team. Not necessarily a big confrontation, it doesn't have to be, but I think we need to understand that not everybody in a museum team has the same views on issues that are quite difficult, complex, sometimes polarizing. So I was wondering how we deal with that. And it could go, you know, it could have two directions. What if a museum director thinks one way and the team thinks another? Or maybe the most difficult, what if members of the team expect something from their museum, but in a hierarchical structure, whoever is up there, it could be a director, a board, or even a government, does not give space for that dissent. Did you have to deal with that, Cristina, in your museum?
Well, actually, I've always been very fortunate, at least in these two last projects that I've been working on, and I think it's because I had the opportunity when I was working for the Museum of Memory. This is it's not an independent institution. It's part of a larger institution called the National Center for Historic Memory, also created by law. And while I was there, my colleagues and the museum director and sort of the philosophy of the center was very much in tune. So of course there were disagreements about one thing or another. One of the biggest disagreements we had between museum and the rest of the center had to do with the fact that when we were developing the project to do a museum as an exhibition before the actual building existed, it was difficult for people who were very sort of deep in their research and had dealt with issues of internal armed conflict for a very long time. It was difficult for them to imagine what kind of exhibit we could do. Okay. So there was a lot of suspicion towards museum workers, like, are they going to, be, how accurate are they going to be? And at the end, it went well for all of us. But then there was a change in the direction of the center, because the director of the center is appointed by the president, and we have a new president since 2018, and I left the museum, and many of my colleagues had a very difficult time dealing with the new administration. And this is a very long story, but to make it short, the last thing that happened in this story of this exhibition is that it's now being discussed at our Transitional Justice Court. So one of the institutions created by, after the Peace Accord of 2016 with one of the oldest guerrillas in the continent, our special jurisdiction for peace is now having a big debate on the current administration's behavior towards museum work. So I won't speak for my colleagues, but I know that it was a difficult transition for them, and most of them have left the work at the center. And those who remain, well, I obviously support them, but I think that it's the kind of, especially when you're dealing with human rights violations, to have this sort of opposing ideas about how the work should be done is tremendously difficult.
Yeah, but I don't know how much you can talk about it, but is it a question of not recognizing human rights violations, or having a difference of opinion as to the way of approaching a subject like this?
Well, at first, the current director of the center did not acknowledge that Colombia has an internal armed conflict. Since then, he's changed his mind. But let's say his methodology and the way that he thinks museum work should be done varies immensely from the work that was done since from 2013 to 2018. So there's opposition towards how a museum should play a role in symbolic reparation. There's very different worldviews, and even though sometimes you should sit down with people who think differently from you, many times that can also legitimate behaviors which I personally consider are not, I currently consider that the work that's being done officially, and I'm talking about the center's director or the director of the museum, I don't think it's fulfilling its role as a transitional justice institution.
Okay. Before I pass to Richard, one more question about this. Do you think the public is aware of this difference, this change of course within the museum? Have they expressed themselves in any way?
I think that's a very good question, actually. I'm not sure. I'm not sure because the work of these kinds of museums, or any museum actually, that's activist in a way that it looks for deeper transformations in society. So we know that this has to be sustained work, right? So what my perception is that the work of the Memory Museum, and there's different reasons and responsibilities that that we have, that people who worked on this project have, including myself, is that that kind of conversation that was started previous to 2018, but it had a sort of climax with this exhibition that went to 2 main cities in Colombia. After that, the conversation kind of disappeared. And right now the conversation is more about censorship, or it's geared towards conversations about content and whether the center and the museum are respecting or not victims' rights. So this is not what we should be working on in this field of transitional justice. We shouldn't be questioning the very foundation of the museum, but this is where we're at. So, but you know, these kinds of, I'm inclined to think that this might be a sort of very small conversation, because as we know, with pandemic, with social unrest, we go back to the beginning. Like, what are museums good for under these contexts? Like, people are hungry, people are, there's different things going on. So do we care about these other conversations? And it's okay to not care, because there's other things that are going on.
Yeah. Richard, you talk to a lot of people. You are yourself involved in a number of projects that raise social concerns. How do you think these issues are dealt with internally? Do you feel there is space for dissent within the museum team?
There has to be, doesn't there? There has to be, and given those kind of, as Cristina put, kind of differing worldviews. I mean, you could take both past and also current work we're doing around, say, LGBTQ equality, which remains a kind of hot button topic still in the UK and in many parts of the world. You can see a different worldview on like two levels. One is about the validity of LGBTQ equality. So most people recognizing it's important, but some expressions of transphobia or homophobia, which are explicitly against that. But perhaps more widely, you've got a different worldview in, well, what role should the museum play in relation to it? So on a sort of, even people who support LGBTQ equality in the organizations that we work with of varying sort of sizes and structures, a spectrum of kind of appetite for how far you want to be really explicit in your support for that issue and harness your resources to pull people towards it, or to what extent you need to be less political, more neutral, hold these things up for debate, which I find really problematic. And you know, we've used these, we work with organizations to build an ethical framework so that there is, you know, there has to be debate, it has to be co-shaped, but also it has to have a kind of strong ethical foundation that the institution, so within all the different individual viewpoints, the institution has to stand on a particular, have clarity on where it stands. So if you take, I don't know, I'm on an advisory group for a project at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and the exhibition is just opening post-pandemic, Beyond the Binary, that looks at LGBTQ issues across those collections. You know, and you find within the organization tremendous support for explicitly supporting LGBTQ equality, but Pitt Rivers is, you know, it's part of the university, it's part of the city of Oxford that has had quite a public high profile debate around trans rights. And there was much discussion in the museum about how the museum could be positioned in relation to these different debates and the ethics of it. The ethical positioning that we all thought through was recognizing that the only way forward would be to stand with trans equality and to make that an explicit statement, because anything less would risk complicity with trans oppression, would make the museum no longer a space for coming in, learning, feeling able to be part of that community on which that whole exhibition was founded. Yeah. So there's a nervousness in some places around doing this. You mentioned our project, Prejudice and Pride, with the National Trust, which was marking, you know, the National Trust alongside many cultural institutions in the UK, marking 50 years of a major landmark in LGBTQ equality in the law. You know, that organisation often has said, you know, we're not allowed to be political. It's part of our kind of setup as a charity. But of course, it campaigns on all sorts of issues, from climate change through to you know, culture for everyone. And so you take an issue just because it divides people, like LGBTQ inclusion, and you had to think there, we had to spend some time before we went public working out, were we telling stories and letting visitors make up their own mind, or were we standing with? And in, you know, we adopted a position which was to stand with, to celebrate LGBTQ equality, to share stories in ways which made that position clear, and used all sorts of interpretive devices to persuade people, to move people along a spectrum of understanding towards, you know, support for that group and for that issue. But those things, you know, it takes time to get to that. And we had a number of pillars. We had a kind of ethical or moral basis for doing it. We had a business case for doing it. We had a curatorial, kind of historically authentic case for doing that work. And a lot of that was co-produced with a mixture of outside influences, of which we were part of it, but also a chance to understand and hear different voices. I mean, I must just share a very brief anecdote. You know, we arrived at that position of support for LGBTQ equality. The National Trust is massive. It had 65,000 staff and volunteers. We're moving across the country. And halfway through this year-long programme, we ended up at one property where we were urged to open a kind of town hall discussion with the 500 volunteers that that worked at this property, because we were told they had concerns, and we were urged to listen, to really hear those concerns. And as Cristina said, that opens up a space in which quite difficult things can be expressed. And I wasn't really comfortable with that. I was more concerned with holding true to the position which we'd worked hard to arrive at. But actually, and I still reflect on it to this day, it's about 3 years ago, we did let people speak their minds and concerns. And although it was quite uncomfortable for many of us in the room, there was quite a lot of explicit and more often veiled sort of prejudice being expressed. By allowing people to share their viewpoints, many of them moved quite quickly to be supportive of the institutional position. And I learned a lot that day. It was exhausting and still quite bruising, if I'm really honest, but I think I learned to allow more space for dissent while still making your case for a more ethical position. It definitely let people come off their pedestals with some dignity and decide to be part of the conversation. Two people left and slammed the door. We never saw them again, but that leaves 498 that didn't.
In the room, involved, yeah. It's a very interesting case for me, prejudice and pride. And for friends who are with us today, the report of this project is available online, and you can consult it. Of course, I went because that's many times my quest is mission-driven activism, and I was thinking again, what is the mission of the National Trust? Because of course they knew it was going to be controversial, discussing LGBTQI heritage, a very conservative organization, a membership organization. So it was the members, it was the staff, it was a lot of people involved. And then I went to check, I think it's mentioned in the report, and it says that the National Trust's mission is looking after special places forever, for everyone. And that's where sometimes, if we have a mission, if we're clear about why it is that we do, what is the purpose of our existence, maybe that's where we can find some support. It's not a law, but it's a mission. And it gives us some guidance, and it helps us tell other people why we stand where we stand. I always look for that somehow. Cristina, I don't know if you want to say something. You look like thinking about something. Otherwise, we have a very interesting question also in the chat. Would you like to?
I was just thinking, trying to draw in what you were just saying to our current situation in our city museum, which is something that we've been grappling with. How do we explicitly make our mission and our projects respond to different like different dynamics, and also to this idea of we were briefly discussing whether, as museum professionals or institutions, are we going to learn anything from the past year? And we weren't being that optimistic, but maybe we can throw in a little bit of optimism, because in the last project, one of the last projects we did at the Museo de Bogotá was a smaller project that dealt with ideas of how do we imagine a future? How do we pull in issues like solidarity and care into this? So I think that, and this goes back to the issue of mission and vision, and how do we throw in these other ideas about recognizing others and caring for people we don't know, and solidarity, and these other things that have come up in the last year. So I was just kind of thinking about that.
Yeah, I think about that a lot as well. The question of care and solidarity, and how we're going to deal with it from now on. Yeah. The question in the chat is the following. It's Denise Polini asking, in the preface of the book Museum Activism, the editors approach the theme of the erosion of trust in institutions. So I would like to ask the guests, what is their view about this problem, adding the effects of the pandemic, the erosion of trust?
I'll perhaps jump in briefly. It's a great question, Denise. And, I've always been fascinated in the idea that museums are trusted institutions, which, there are numerous surveys that find that there are those high levels of trust, even as ideas of the museums, complicity in things like colonialism and slavery, for example, are more and more widely known. There is still this looking for places where information has been carefully considered, weighed up, presented in a way that isn't immediate and spontaneous and partisan, but has nevertheless sort of been filtered or mediated somehow to be as correct as it might be. It's such an interesting one, and of course, the activist museum potentially threatens that, especially in a world that is increasingly polarized, because just as in the UK, you pick your newspaper according to your politics. That's the one you believe, and you pick holes in the other side because it's evil and wrong, and it's got the wrong politics behind it. So you dismiss it and undermine it and pick holes in it, and you pick your own politics. As the museum has to find its way through something, of course, there is a danger that the trust that it's held in itself is eroded. I mean, for us, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter last summer was just such a momentous thing for UK museums, because even those organisations at the most conservative end, who would never normally make a public statement about something in the news like that, were all, there were demands that the British Museum, the National Gallery, all of those museums would make a statement in support of Black Lives Matter. And they did, many of them did, and some of that was performative, as the way Cristina alerted us to the danger of just performing those things. But others, it sparked a more serious introspection and looking at a greater, a series of processes of greater openness and transparency and shift and change. So they're really fascinating, these things, because currently in the UK, our government is starting to undermine the gains that have been made by that movement by positioning anything in support of something like Black Lives Matter as the noisy radical activism, the end of that spectrum, which is undesirable, untrustworthy, and so on. So there's such rich discussions to think through.
And of course, yeah, our 60 minutes today together will not answer all these, but we are looking, you know, we are thinking of ways of taking this conversation further. Before we close, Richard, would you like to talk to us a bit about the Activist Museum Award?
I'd love to. So Robert James and I worked on museum activism with you both, Cristina and Maria, over 18 months, a couple of years to do that. Part of the ambition of that book was not just to shine a spotlight on this trend towards more purposeful work, but to try and amplify it, encourage it, stimulate more of that experimentation in this emerging field. And so Bob James had the idea of setting up the Activist Award that would make a concrete contribution towards that area of work. So he set up the awards with us in the research centre at Leicester, and we put out an open call. We have made, for 2 years, we have made 3 awards each year, and they're to a range of different organisations. It's a small financial contribution, they get £1,000 each, but they're also, we stay close to them and see if there's other ways in which we can support and amplify them. And it's really trying to kind of put our money where our mouth is. It's trying to kind of actively stimulate new practice that reflects the ideals of the book. And in the first year, we had big national museums like the International Slavery Museum, through to brilliant staff network Museum as Muck that looks at working class, supporting working class professionals, through to the Climate Museum UK that's tackling the climate crisis. And in the most recent iteration, the Museum of Transology, the organisation Journey to Justice, and 100 Stories in 100 Worlds. And they are amazing projects. We're learning lots from them. As I say, the financial contribution is small, but it's so exciting to be able to encourage them and find ways to support and learn from what they're doing. You can find all the details out on our website. Yes. Hopefully that gives you a little flavour of the work that's happening there. We'll be putting out the call for next year's later on. Sadly, it's only available to UK-based institutions at the moment, but we have hopes to try and spread that more widely.
Great. Yeah, we have one last exciting question, and although we are approaching the end of our conversation, I would like to ask you to comment on this. Pietra Fraga is saying that recently a scholar was arguing, and many agreeing, that maybe activism shouldn't be extended to all museums. Maybe they should get involved and less neutral according to their profile, leaving to some other organizations the less neutral subjects. Hence, some should be more activist than others. In the book, you speak about the immorality of action. What could sorry, I don't understand. What could we step in and bring to all museums the relevance of the everyday?
Christina.
I'll step in. You know, if we look at the history of museums, we know that the museum has never, ever, ever, ever been neutral. So museums at their birth were knowledge and scientific and practice machines that supported the birth of capitalism. And so even if it was a natural science museum, a history museum, art museum, it doesn't matter. So can we today really think that a science museum, for instance, does not need to engage in a deep reflection about what it has been, how it's supported, for instance, visions of nature that have led us to the place where we're at right now? And can it actually not do anything around climate and social crisis? So I think that's what the immorality of not doing anything goes back to. And going back to what Richard was saying at the beginning, you know, maybe this this science museum doesn't need to put banners in their, in their facade, but it does need to, first of all, tell their audiences like what museums have done and how they've contributed to colonization, imperialism, capitalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it needs to do something about it, because we can't hide under this sort of mask that Richard was describing as, oh yes, museums are places of knowledge. We know that's not true. Museums are places where we form our ideas of the world, where we learn to engage with others in conversations about what we're looking or what we're feeling and what we're experiencing. Museums are also, I think, a way to recognize who is a museum subject, who is a museum object. I still deeply remember my visit to the African American National Museum of History and Culture at the Smithsonian. And what was so striking for me was to look at Black audiences dealing with these immensely complex conversations about historic and systemic violence. And so, this museum and their permanent exhibition, it dedicates, well, most of it has to do with repression and violence, but it dedicates one complete floor to this issue of enslavement. And you could say, oh, that's the past. People were not talking about the past. Yes, of course, they were looking at objects and texts, and they were sort of obviously appalled at everything, but they were talking about violence today. So we need to get over this issue of neutrality, and it can be more in the sense of the normative activism, which is just to acknowledge that we are, if we still believe that museums play a role in transformation.
Yeah, we need braver museums, I think, because what you just described makes so much sense, Cristina, but we need to be brave enough and to take the risk of doing this introspection, and we're not always available and open to that. Richard, last word from you.
Oh, I think Cristina absolutely nailed it.
She did, didn't she?
Brilliantly put. And I love, but our idea about the immorality of inaction is simply to say, once you recognise, and there is an abundance of evidence that museums aren't somehow separate from the world. They are active in shaping it, in making it. They are part of that world, that every day that your colleague pointed to. Once you accept that museums are active, they shape things, there is an immorality in using that agency of the institution for good rather than for bad. Just one example that's quite in people's minds here in the UK would be Kew Gardens, the major national botanic gardens that has recently come under attack because it is doing decolonising work just to talk about where plants came from in its collection and how closely knit to empire and colonialism that institution's history is. And they've just been very deft and skillful at saying, this is just, it has to be done. In this day and age, you're either complicit in hiding those acts of violence and oppression, or you can play a part in being more open and transparent and recognizing that. And it can be as simple as that. It's simple in one sense, complex in another. But I think there is a role for every single museum, even though that might grow out of its history and its particular collections and the context within which it's operating. But I think this idea of being socially purposeful or activist or simply looking at ways in which it can be a force for good in the world is something that every museum could be part of.
That's lovely. Thank you both so much for accepting our invitation to have this conversation today. I would like to apologize to you and to friends and colleagues who are with us here about the technical issues we had, but we are recording this conversation, and we will soon make it available so that we can listen to it again. Thank you both very, very much, and see you soon again, I hope.
Thanks for having me.